Alrighty, how we doing, geometry peeps? Hope that test went well. If not, please get with your teacher and figure out a time to come in and get some remediation and get things figured out. Get a retake on that. Um, Other than that, we're gonna go ahead and get into some angle relationships here. Remember earlier in the year we talked about how if we have two rays, two rays that share an endpoint. So maybe, for example, if we have ray B A here and it shares that endpoint B C, we would say that this space between the rays is our angle measure. So we would call this angle A, B, C. So if we have two angles, we could say that two angles are related in certain ways if certain conditions are met. So here today we're going to learn about how to identify these kinds of angles and how to use the correct term to describe these angles. So our first relationship that we're going to talk about is vertical angles. So let's go ahead and get a definition first. Vertical angles are two angles that are across from each other, on intersecting lines. One thing about these vertical angles are they are always congruent. Remember, congruent meaning that they are the same size, same shape. So if two angles are congruent, they have the same exact angle measure. So, for example, if we have we need two intersecting lines to have vertical angles. So if we have a line here and another line, I can do better than that. Say like so. If we have two intersecting lines, we would say that the two angles across from each other, like 1 and 2, those are our vertical angles. So we could say that the measure of angle 1 is equal to the measure of angle 2. And they see how we have them across from each other. That means they are vertical angles. We could also have vertical angles in on the other side too, like 3 and 4. 3 and 4 would also be vertical angles. So we could also say that the measure of angle 3 is congruent to the measure of angle 4. Okay. So biggest thing here, we got to have the intersecting lines. And when they're across from each other, we call those vertical angles. Vertical angles are always congruent. Okay, so the next relationship that we're going to talk about is adjacent angles. So our definition of adjacent angles is two angles that are next to each other and share a common side. So two angles that are next to each other and share that common side. So let's take a look at what we mean by sharing that common side. So, for example, we might have one larger angle that might look something like so. We got an angle here. If we have another angle that goes through that, we would have one angle here and one angle here. Angles 1 and 2 would be adjacent because they share this. This would be our common side. And with adjacent angles, we know that these two angles have to add together to be the sum of this larger angle. So if we know that this larger angle is 100 degrees and we know that angle 2 is 20 degrees, we can do 100 minus 20 to get what angle, the measure of angle 1, which would be 80 degrees. So biggest thing here, adjacent angles share this common side, and we know that angle 1 plus angle 2 has to be the sum together to be this larger angle measure here. Okay. So we're actually going to jump down next. We're going to talk about our angle relationships. First, we're going to talk about complementary angles. So let's get a definition for complementary angles. Complementary angles are any two angles whose sum is 90 degrees. Okay. So what we mean by that is if we have one angle that is whoops, spelled two wrong. Go back here. That toe, any two angles whose sum is, I'm actually going to go back and we're going to use the degree symbol. So any two angles whose sum is 90 degrees. So if we have an angle like so, let's say maybe if we know that this angle is 70 degrees and we have another angle whose measure we know to be 20 degrees, we know 70 plus 20 is 90. So these two angles would be indeed complementary angles. And just like complementary, we also have another relationship that is supplementary. And similarly, supplementary is any two, angles whose sum is 180 degrees. So let's take a look at an example for supplementary. So we've got complementary. Complementary is 90. And we also have supplementary, whose sum is 180 degrees. So, for example, we might have an angle like so. Let's say we know that the measure of this angle is 120 degrees. Well, we know in order to have a supplementary angle to that, its supplement would need to be, well, 120 plus what? Well, 120 plus 60 is 180. So these two would be supplementary angles. So far we've got vertical angles, two angles across from each other on intersecting lines. They're always congruent. We have adjacent angles, two angles that are next to each other, share a common side. Complementary, sum is 90 degrees. Supplementary, the sum of the angle measures is 180 degrees. We can even take that a step further, and let's talk about linear pair. Linear pair gets a little bit more specific, because we're going to use two of our relationships already. So a linear pair is two angles that are not only adjacent, so the two angles that are adjacent to each other, they also have to be they have to be supplementary. So two angles that are adjacent and supplementary to each other. And we also know that they form a straight line. So let's take a look at what we mean by that. So we got two angles that are both adjacent and supplementary. So we have to fit both of those categories there. Two angles that are adjacent and supplementary. Let's take a look at an example of that. So if we have a straight line like so, we know that is 180 degrees. Now if we have, I'm going to try and get a little bit more straight of a line here. Let's just use my line tool. So let's say that we have a straight line. We know that the measure of that straight line is 180 degrees. But if we have another angle coming off of that, okay, and we know if we have an angle here, one, and an angle here, two, these two angles for sure are adjacent because they share this common side. And we also know that since they form a straight line, they have to be supplementary. So we would say that the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 has to be equal to, you guessed it, 180. 180 degrees. So just to recap here, we've got 5 different angle relationships. We have our vertical angles have to be across from each other and they're always congruent. We have adjacent angles sharing a common side, complementary 90, supplementary 180, and a linear pair that is adjacent and supplementary. Make sure you get these notes copied down. If you need to, pause it and get these copied down on that hard copy of the notes. Keep that in your notebook. Make sure you use that as a reference as we move forward. You will also need it on the CFU. There are plenty of questions involving our angle relationships. Other than that, geometry peeps, you guys have a great day, and we will see you soon.